my name is Margot Warren. I'm the chief of the Media Relations branch and a senior advisor at the Office of Neuroscience Communications and Engagement, otherwise known as ONCE, at NINDS. So glad you have joined us today for this workshop. We had a few communications workshops at the PI meeting last year, and they were very popular. So welcome back. I know it's the end of the day. Thanks for sticking around, and it's going to be worth your while. This is the Science Communications Workshop. The title of the talk is Stories About Science, Narrative Methods in Science Communication and Correcting Misinformation. So I want to give a little plug to offices like ours who do communications full-time. And please, I know each of your institutions has something like a ONCE office, press, media, marketing. We would love it if you would get in touch with those people when you perhaps are inspired by the end of this workshop to want to do a little more communicating. You have those professionals on hand to help you. So today we have a wonderful presenter, Liz Neely. I've heard her talk. You're in for a great treat. And Liz is the executive director of the Story Collider. It's a nonprofit organization dedicated to true personal stories about science told live on stage. Previously, Liz studied behavior and evolution and has specialized in all aspects of science communications in her career. She's done it all. Liz has led the Story Collider for the past 5 years, and she is also a lecturer at Yale University. So just a reminder, please use the Q&A box. You can start loading it up with questions throughout the presentation. And then Liz and I will be back to answer your questions live. Thanks so much.
About a month ago, I received a text message from a group of friends. And I read this for your viewing pleasure. If you have time, what do you think of this? And a link to a certain video, now infamous, but I thought, oh no. This is a piece of propaganda about an urgent issue that is facing the public when it comes to science right now, about coronavirus. And the funny thing is, I mean, I am a person who, not that long ago, just wrote an entire piece about how to talk about coronavirus. And yet still getting that message from my friend felt challenging, felt difficult. Now, talking about science communication is not exactly my full-time job. I'm the executive director of a storytelling organization. What consumes my days are the idea of taking scientists, taking people whose lives have been shaped by science and putting them, well, we used to be putting them on stage, now on screen. These are not TED Talks or anything like that. There's no slides, no props. It's just a single person telling a 10-minute long story of something that happened to them in their life that ranges from hilarious to heartbreaking. We record all of these stories, and every Friday a new episode drops on the Story Collider podcast. This is my co-host and my co-director in the organization, Erin Barker. I'm the one in the red dress. And we kind of represent the art and the science sides of the organization, respectively. In addition to these sort of public experiences that we like to produce and share, we also teach workshops and trainings, helping researchers and academics, people working in conservation or medicine or engineering, learn how to do this stage-based performance. So that's the background I bring today when I'm thinking about how we can apply narratives in our science communication and in correcting misinformation in the public sphere. In addition to my work at Story Collider, though, the perspectives that I knit together range from the kinds of committees that I sit on around public engagement with science and technology at AAAS, as well as with the Aspen Institute. My academic seat is at Yale. I'm a lecturer working with the National Neuroscience Curriculum Initiative, attempting to take cutting-edge neuroscience research and use compelling narratives to package it into digestible, memorable talks that helps psychiatry residents understand and appreciate neuroscience and incorporate that into their own clinical practice. And then finally, the question of misinformation is near and dear to my heart as one of the co-organizers of last April's Sackler Colloquium hosted by the National Academy of Sciences on misinformation in the public sphere. And so when I think about the problems that we collectively face, whether you're a researcher, you're working in government, you're someone who's just very interested in sharing accurate science, I think it's most important for us to appreciate that there are these two dimensions that I mentioned, that we are combining theory and practice. This was something I needed as someone who was trained in science coming into this space. I've spent the past 15 years or so combing through the literature, reading papers in risk communication and the psychology and a little bit of neurocognitive science, but also just trying to wrap my head around the question of what does the scientific research community understand about how people make sense of the world around them and how they process information, how they make decisions. So I think that is most useful to us. Now, my problem was I entered this tech quest with an incredibly simple mental model of my challenge. I thought, I want to understand how to get people to trust me or trust science, trust scientists. I will go read the research on trust or whatever else it might be, and I will get an answer. And I thought this was going to be a very linear pathway, but any of us who've ever worked in research recognize this is frankly ludicrous, right? The reality is that I went down many, many pathways, and all that's happened is I've recognized there is a substantial gap between theory and practice, between the kind of research that's being done and the kinds of questions that I was asking. And so I think that for those of us who are interested in these questions of how can we be effective and ethical in our science communication, whether that's using stories or any other format, it's important to think about how we apply that research that we're drawing from. So I'll keep this brief, but a framework that I found really helpful is on using academic theories in practice. And it lays out these three sort of approaches: instrumental, conceptual, and translational approaches of using the research, using academic products, exploring content of interest to us, and of trying to apply it in our daily lives, because that's what we're doing here, right? Like, you're sitting in this talk, listening to me right now, because you want to leave at the end of it, both being introduced to interesting questions, getting a sense of what the literature is and like where opportunities might be, but more practically asking, how do you, for example, answer your colleagues or your friends or your family, applying those principles? So what I feel like we can say with the most certainty in all of the reading across many disciplines, many of which are not speaking to each other, is that perhaps the single most consistent thing that we understand is that human beings in general struggle to understand what other people think and why. We overestimate how much agreement people have with us, or we overestimate how highly they think of us. The ways in which we get this wrong would be laughable if the stakes weren't so incredibly high. One of the big problems I see with this is that those of us who are trained in the hard sciences or who come from research backgrounds tend to fall into making the same mistakes over and over again. And one of those is the idea that if we face an apathetic or oppositional audience, the solution is simply to give them data, because surely the problem is understanding. And if only they had sufficient information, they would agree with our interpretation of it. Right? Does that sound familiar to you? I know I made that mistake early in my career. That idea is called the information deficit model. It presumes that people are empty vessels that just need to be filled. And that is a zombie idea. It is a stinking shambles that follows me around. The best available communications research and science tells us that simply attempting to, quote unquote, educate or throw more data at people who are not already inclined to agree with us or trust us is a fool's errand. Now, this is not to say that the data doesn't matter. It absolutely excruciatingly does. And so, for example, in particular, if I'm asking the question of how do we effectively talk about something like the global pandemic we're all currently experiencing, I think it's essential that we look to rigorous, valid data sets, similar to, for example, Corona Data US, which is being run by Dr. Redbird out of Northwestern University, surveying more than 200 people every day about attitudes, beliefs, and their current reality. This kind of foundational understanding of what attitudes and opinions and if the facts of the matter are is essential, just as many other kinds of scientific facts that you may be trying to communicate. But here's the thing. If we understand anything, we understand that you cannot displace complex and especially not strong feelings with simple facts. And one of the clearest sort of ways of thinking through this, because I remember rejecting this idea early on and saying, the facts matter, we have to have a shared basis of our understanding of reality. The way to kind of get into this, if you're having that kind of strong emotional reaction, is to think about risk in particular. When people ask me, of all of the hundreds of papers that are in my shared Zotero library online, which I would love to read with you if you want to talk about them, sort of where do they start? What's the one thing that they should read? I point them to Baruch Fischoff's classic paper from 1995, and it is about 20 years of risk communication. And it lays out his core argument that ontology recapitulates phylogeny. And what he's saying is that every time a new group of scientific experts discover that they have a risk communication problem, they reinvent the wheel. They go through the same process of thinking, well, all we need to do is to get the numbers right. And you've seen us scrambling to do that. And then we think, oh, well, all we have to do is tell them the numbers. Perhaps we need to put those numbers into context that they understand. And especially maybe we should show them that they have accepted similar risks in the past or all the time. And then we continue down this pathway and saying, oh, hey, well, we should show them that this is fair or is a smart trade-off or judgment. We should be kind and perhaps collaborative. We need to make them partners. Perhaps we need to tell them stories. The thing is, over and over again, we see communities of experts wasting time figuring out what the communication research tells us. And a visual for that helped me kind of wrap my head around this is that if we think about how people make sense of a risk situation, a consequentialist perspective would imagine that we do extensive cognitive elaboration. So we're thinking hard, and we're thinking about the probability of an outcome. And there's a subjective layer to it of like whether how bad it might be. And that as a result of our cognitive evaluation, we simultaneously experience feelings, but then also make a decision. Functionally, this assumes that people are rational actors. And I think all of us can appreciate this is the equivalent of, the spherical cow assumption in physics, I think. A better approach or understanding of risks is this, a risks as feelings perspective, in which we still see those anticipated outcomes and subjective probabilities going through cognitive evaluation, but also we know that external factors, just everything else that you're coping with, your available attention, the vividness of the risk presented to you, the immediacy of the threat as you experience, influences both your thoughts and your feelings about this, and both of those lead to the judgment that you come to the decision that you make. A more crass way of putting this, but hopefully more memorable, is something I cannot believe I ever got through peer review. But in a book chapter, I captured the idea as follows. So risk is a social construct. It is not something that is objective or can be measured independent of the individuals who are making that judgment of risk. And it is perceived hazard times outrage. Or for those of you who are very online, as I am at the moment, we can say this by saying risk equals OMG times WTF, right? Hazard and outreach. Hazard can take many different forms too. And one of the most important things I think we need to grapple with, and what was really enlightening for me early on in my career when I was trying to understand why people didn't seem to be rational, didn't seem to be paying attention to the data in the way I wanted them to, is to appreciate that our conversations about science are not existing in a vacuum. They happen in the reality of our world. And the reality of our world is that our identities, our political opinions, our ideological stances all get entangled with how we interpret signals. And this leads to a situation which is called identity threat. It's the idea that if I tell you my position on certain hot button topics like climate change, for example, or it used to be the case vaccination was partially polarized like this, that we knew what your political identity was. And we have all too often, I'm afraid, in science, adapted this rhetoric of us versus them, of like an anti-science public that just rejects rational thinking and data, because we have seen some of this behavior in highly polarized topics. But this is an empirical question. And I look to work by Dan Kahan, for example, and others, showing that we have to understand the specific question, specific arena, the topic that we are looking at. These rainbow charts behind him are different issue areas, global warming, nanotechnology, for example. And it shows you that we don't see strong polarization across every science topic. We have to treat each one separately. And this is where we need the social science data to help us be effective. The other way that we can be effective in science communication, if you do not have that data available to you, is to look to personal narratives. And this is where our work comes in. So on my stages, in our podcast, we have experts, we have scientists, we have people talking about topics like climate change and coral bleaching, about LGBTQ identity and coming out and what it is like to have a minority sexual orientation in a world that doesn't accept that. We have stories about police brutality and violence. We have stories about animal experimentation. We have stories about abortion. Literally every issue that you know would cause the largest amount of emotional argumentation. Story Collider produces stories about them, and we don't experience massive amounts of blowback. Part of the reason in this is that when information is packaged in a way that is a personal lived experience, when people are paying attention to, this is what happened to me, this is what I felt, this is what I saw, it's not functioning as the same kind of identity threat as claims to, this is how the world actually is, and you and your entire political party are wrong. And so really, as a pragmatic issue, I look to stories as a way to help me lower those perceived threats to identity and help people connect to the ideas that we want to talk about. So let's focus on effective science communication. When I ponder the question of how do I define this, for me, it comes down to three things. What I want to have at the end of the day is that the understanding of my audience, person walks away with an understanding that is correct. It helps me personally to distinguish between accuracy and precision, but with a focus on accuracy. Is the information correct? Then second, I have the question of, is it going to be retained? Have I managed to create a memorable experience so that sometime in the future, someone will say, oh yes, I know that, rather than, oh, someone told me about that once, but I can't remember what they said. And then finally, that the framework of analysis I have helped sort of integrate into this person's worldview endures. And this is really important because I think audiences who are not used to being involved in research themselves can feel quite frustrated when it feels like there's just contradictory studies coming out. One says this is good for you, one says this is bad for you, and they think, oh, well, scientists don't know what they're talking about. Instead, I'm very interested in helping people appreciate why and how we come to the conclusions that we do. And so thinking about narratives, for example, as a way to share the process of science is so much more powerful and lasting in that enduring sense than simply communicating the products of that research. And so for me, the reason that I have invested the past 5 years of my career at Story Collider and in storytelling specifically is that when it comes to these goals, the communications research suggests that stories or narratives are processed by a privileged cognitive pathway. People listen to them and interpret them differently. They engage with them differently than they do with evidence-based argumentation. And as a result of the particular kind of processing that human beings use in a narrative sense, we see several outcomes. One, stories are more interesting, they're more engaging. People want to listen to them, they want to start listening to them, they want to keep listening to them more than anything else. They are more comprehensible. This surprised me to learn that people understand better when information is presented in a narrative format, as opposed to just a strict chronology or bullet points or statistics. People understand the information better as a story. And then, of course, for my interests, they are found to be more believable as well as more persuasive for those skeptical audiences. Understanding this means a lot to me because it helps me appreciate and take a step back from, for example, we know that humans are cognitive misers. We will minimize the amount of directed effort that we have to undertake in order to take new information and slot it into existing worldviews. We call these heuristics, you can call them biases. They're mental shortcuts. And what you see here is a beautiful visualization of just some of the several hundred kinds of cognitive biases that have been identified. And we can zoom in on one quadrant that currently feels quite relevant, where there's a glut of information, but not enough meaning. And we know that humans tend to make kinds of mistakes, like we imagine patterns where there aren't any. We simplify probabilities and numbers to make them easier to think about. And so early in my career, I hoped that understanding these biases, and particularly understanding like the neurological substrates and correlates of these things, like brain science, I thought could help me understand people. Like I wanted to know, okay, what fear circuitry is triggered by a rhetoric that evokes threat, and how can we use positive narratives to counteract that kind of thing. There is amazing work being done in these spaces. And I'm also really excited about the kinds of work coming out of like the Hassan Lab and Jack Gallant's lab and people who are doing neuroimaging studies and understanding what's happening in the brain as we listen to stories. I love that stuff. But I think it can be just a distraction, because we have to remember that human beings are not isolated brains. We are individuals who are deeply embedded in social networks that shape our experience of reality and our understanding of it. So we have to take into account psychology and also sort of mass behavior if we want to get at why do people do what they do, why do they think what they think. There are a few practical resources that I want to just take a moment to point to, because I think they're really helpful in moments like this, and I'm glad I got my hands on them. They include things like the Debunker's Handbook and also the Conspiracy Theory Handbook. Cook and Lewandowski in particular are authors that have been important in helping me understand how do we translate the academic research on conspiracy thinking or on correcting misinformation to allow us to do these things efficiently. And if you only remember one thing from this talk, it's that please do not repeat a piece of information in order to attempt to correct it, because you are inadvertently normalizing it by making it sound more common, more frequent, which taps into a bias that makes it feel more correct. When I think about storytelling, though, There's quite a gap in the research here. I can't give you citations about specifically powerful sound bites of how stories help counteract information. So I need to walk you through sort of the theory that I use. So for example, I look to papers like this one from Nabi and Green, which are looking at the role of emotion in narratives. So the ups and downs that a storyteller or a character in a piece experiences as we listen to the plot unfold. And here you can see figure 1, where we've got narrative transportation, that delicious feeling of being sucked into a story, having a sort of a positive feedback cycle with emotional shifts. So when the story is sad, we feel sad, right? The more deeply you are involved in the story, the sadder you feel, or the happier you feel, whatever it might be. And then that leads to a specific sort of set of behaviors that we want to encourage. Those include information seeking, repeated viewing, social sharing, and memory. So in other words, powerful stories that involve emotional ups and downs, so that's the craft of storytelling, don't necessarily teach people something. They don't imbue a specific concept or change their mind even, but they do lead to these indirect outcomes that I think are ultimately more empowering. They get people to talk about what they've heard. They encourage them to go seek more on their own and to review the material again and to remember it in the future. This, I think, is a powerful goal and a powerful outcome. So the final piece of what I want to be thinking about together today is the question of, okay, so we've explored a bit what effective science communication looks like and how stories can be one effective pathway to our collective goals. But there's another piece to this as well, and that's ethical science communication. For me, a simple visual helps kind of capture the idea of what I'm asking here. So if I show you this little doodle and ask you what it is, you might tell me. You might also think, okay, once I know what it is, it's my job to tell other people what it is. But I think the reality is that we live in complex, ambiguous worlds, and it's not that there is one determined answer. Knowledge is contextual. Information is contingent. And so what I think of science communication and my personal goal is to help people make sense of the context, to be able to interpret the ideas, the facts, the data, whatever it is that we have, rather than just unquestioningly believe it. Fortunately, there are also papers and people who are studying these questions of ethical communication practices. And specific to my focus on narratives in service of this, I look to papers like this one from Michael Dahlstrom and Shirley Ho that's looking at ethical considerations of using narrative to communicate science. What I like in their framework in particular was it introduced the idea that you could, in theory, have a particular anecdote, one story that was factually correct all the way through, and yet it could still be misrepresenting the overall picture if it's an extreme outlier. So I think about stories needing not only to be verifiably true in the plot of them and the details of them, but also representative of our best current understanding of reality. I also I'm a practical person, a pragmatic person, so I really appreciate other research approaches to this, like this one, where we see Kate Starbird laying out a decision framework of how do you decide when to correct misinformation in online spaces? Because sometimes the ethical question is, am I obligated to correct it every time I see a mistake or I see an argument that is not correct? And I think frameworks like this can help us manage our energy, our own emotions, and also be more effective and ethical as we move through our online and in-person spaces. I have another sort of set of 3 guidelines that help sum up what I think of when I think of ethical science communication and sort of what I've packaged this talk around. So for me, ethical science communication includes 3 components again. One is that it respects the agency of the audience. This is the difference between persuasion, which I think is a valid and legitimate goal, versus manipulation, in which you are just trying to achieve compliance, for example, or a attitudinal change without any kind of respect for the people that you're whose minds you're trying to change. So recognizing that your audience has valid questions and perspectives to bring into this space and is able to make up their own minds rather than just, they're not children. Even children should be treated with respect. I think also ethical science communication appreciates the relative position of the expert. This for me is important in questions of like, are you a member of the community that you're trying to educate or convince to do something? Are you someone who is a member of a group that has historically been very privileged, speaking to communities that have been marginalized, that have been oppressed, that have been silenced, appreciating that not all of us are meeting each other on equal footing is really important. And then finally, in terms of being ethical in our science communication, I think this one's easy for all of us who have trained in science and come from research backgrounds. We must be clear about the limitations of the data and never overreach what the science says. I think it's appropriate and sometimes even necessary and the kind and ethical thing to do to say, look, we don't know the answer. We don't have the data yet. My personal take on this or how I'm coping with it at the moment is, but in order to answer that question, we would need the following things. That to me is a form of ethical science communication. And what I'm ultimately pushing towards, what I'm hoping that we can accomplish, whether you're using stories or not, in setting up the ways you're approaching either the science communication of your own discipline, your own expertise, your own papers, or things far outside your field, but you are a scientist moving through the world who is representing a scientific viewpoint, is that I think the idea of deliberative discourse is a powerful one. I don't merely want to change someone's mind. I want to lead them. I want to build a process through which they change their own mind and they are able to think more clearly in the future as it may allow. In order to do this, in order to have deliberative discourse, we need four things. One is accurate information, which can be a challenge for certain. But I think this, for us, in many instances, the people watching this, we can feel reasonably satisfied that we have a best approximation of this through peer review, through the processes that make science self-correcting. We have some sense of what is accurate. Then we also need to make sure that, especially if we are talking about shifting community perspectives or that of more than a single individual, that we have representative diversity. And I mean this in every sense of the word. Different perspectives, different lived experiences, people of all different kinds coming together because that variety of response, reaction, and analysis, perspective, context helps really make this a legitimate conversation. We also need to have the parties enter in a deliberative stance. This means that there's mutual respect and that you're living the ideal of science, that you will change your mind if the data dictates, that you will listen to the points that your audience or your partner in the conversation are making. You will acknowledge when you don't know. And this, I think, is easy to slide away from ourselves when we feel frustrated or under attack or like someone just isn't listening and they're not being based in reality, they're not being logical. It's easy to slip out of that deliberative stance. It's hard to acknowledge when you don't know things. It's hard to change your mind or to signal that you can. But just a small amount of reciprocal sort of exchange can go a long way toward legitimizing a dialogue. And then finally, and this is a hard one, is we know that any kind of meaningful exchange takes time. And so for me, this goes towards the fact that we cannot be all things to all people. There's an XKCD cartoon that always makes me laugh, of a little figure typing on a computer, and there's a voice from the other room saying, "Honey, come to bed." And they say, "I can't. Someone on the internet is wrong." For me, this also helps keep clearly in mind what I'm attempting to achieve in any conversation. It's not that I necessarily need to win. I think winning is a damaging framework, but rather that I show people that I respect them. I explain where I'm coming from. I bring the best available data or science or information to the table. I surround myself with different kinds of perspectives. And I acknowledge that life is long. We cannot reliably ever trace a particular decision or moment to a specific thing that someone said. That makes for good storytelling. That's rarely the reality of it. You may feel like you've lost an argument or you've failed in attempting to share your science with someone. But if you are approaching it from this place of deliberative discourse, of ethical storytelling, ethical science communication, you may very well have set them up for a slow movement towards some kind of future change. And I think that's worth your time. As I come to a close, I would just want to say, my biggest frustration in science communication and science storytelling and all of this space is the ways in which I see knowledge siloed, and the ways in which we fail to capitalize on all of the rich intellectual discourse and work that has already been done that we can apply to the questions that face us, especially when the stakes are so high. I encourage you to be thinking and reading broadly and to draw from the disciplines that know the most. So for example, for those of us who are thinking like, oh, how do I become an effective science communicator if that's not my primary job? Well, for example, I think looking to the informal science educational sphere and realm can be most helpful. Looking to the ways that teachers are trained can be helpful. And in all of these spaces, what we recognize is that we need iteration. And so I hope you approach your science communication, your storytelling in the same way, that you learn about the theory and the empirical information in some of the papers I was showing you, or that sort of thing, that you practice, that you go from thinking about it to actually doing it. And then that you take and incorporate feedback of, was that successful? Did that make things worse? Was your conversational partner engaged or were they bored? And then you feed that back into your cycle so that you develop a reflective process in improving your ability to be ethical and effective in your communications. So I'll bring this back to that moment where I sat there with my phone in my hand, looking at a text message my friend had sent me that I felt worried me and challenged my ability to communicate about the particular science that at this time was about coronavirus, but it could have been anything. In my essay at The Atlantic, I say that there are sort of 4 quick things that you can do to help brace yourself for this task. The first is to start where you are. To appreciate, like I said, what is your position as an expert relative to the person who's asking? To also recognize the limits of your current knowledge and to build on shared foundations that you already have. To realize that in order to be an effective communicator, you do not need to build an audience of hundreds of thousands of people, but rather you already are a trusted node in the networks of your friends, your families. They're paying attention to you. And this is a place where you can make immediate and perhaps profound and lasting impact. So start where you are. The second thing is about picking your battles. There are plenty of ideological and political battles we need to have. When the stakes are life and death, it's never more important to be able to argue our values and to do so passionately. But it's critical to disentangle when we're doing that from when we're attempting to communicate science. And we know that when we start a science communication conversation by inadvertently triggering all these identity protective mechanisms, that limits the ability to actually have any kind of exchange. This is also the place where you need to take stock of your reality. I mean, we are all in front of our computers right now. You may have small children at home. You may be coping with coronavirus yourself. There's so many different things going on. It's okay to draw boundaries around when you're going to engage and when you're not, and to focus on the places where you can make the most impact. So for example, there's a climate change communication framework called 6 Americas that uses social science data to break down where the bins that people fall into in order to direct the time and effort at sort of the large proportion of people who may be persuaded, who are uncertain, who want more information, rather than our instinct to just argue with the trolls. So pick your battles wisely. The third thing is about avoiding unforced errors. I mean, I sort of referenced that already in terms of accidentally triggering identity protective mechanisms, but there's other things that we do as well. Our instincts do not necessarily serve us at all when it comes to correcting misinformation in particular, or maybe even being persuasive. What you don't want to do is accidentally make someone worry about something that they hadn't worried about before. That's called a boomerang effect. You don't want to further entrench or exacerbate an existing conflict. You also don't want to accidentally make the piece of misinformation feel more common because you've repeated it. You also don't want to undermine trust because you've given too many arguments, and we know that there are cognitive biases that say, well, one strong argument is better than 4 arguments. The final thing here is about, this is your own reflective practice. This should be easy for all of us. It is absolutely what we aspire to in any kind of science and science communication, which is to be honest, not only with our conversational partners, our audiences, our communities, but also with ourselves, to be transparent about the limits of our knowledge. This will also help keep you honest yourself. I'm now repeating myself, but the idea is like, if you interrogate the boundaries of your own knowledge and you recognize where your own understanding is limited, you're doing this all the time in your research practice. In your science communication space, it can help make sure that you are giving accurate information, as well as being that good partner, being that sort of honest broker of information. So in the end, what I want to say is, when I transitioned from science and science communication into storytelling, I have to say, the word itself, storytelling, it used to set my teeth on edge. I didn't like it. I was trained in evolution. I was used to hearing stories in a negative sense, like just so stories. I was thinking that storytelling was equivalent to hand waving, that it was what you did when your data wasn't compelling. And so you wanted to sort of nudge people into your preferred interpretation, like a cheat, that evoking an emotional reaction was somehow manipulative or inappropriate, that it wasn't something serious scientists did. Or, really at the bottom of it, I was a person who desperately wanted to live the life of the mind. And I wanted to distance myself from childish things, and stories sound like, fairy tales or folk tales. But now, as I've done all this reading, as I've matured, as I've watched this, as I've developed a practice fed by both hard-earned stagecraft as well as the best available academic approaches, I tend to think of narratives as stories and the rigor of science as being orthogonal. If you imagine 2 axes in space where across the x we have rigor, so on the right-hand side of the screen is what we are all attempting to achieve, the best possible science, the best way we have of describing reality. And on the y-axis, we'll call this narrative. So really good stories up at the top and low narrative quality down at the bottom. I think we can imagine these different quadrants. Up at the top left, we have entertainment. Sure, it doesn't really matter if the details are right because it's an amazing movie, or, oh my goodness, did you see this week's episode? If we have neither rigor nor narrative, that's just noise. There's plenty of that on the internet. If we have plenty of scientific rigor, but very low narrative quality, well, that's data. I would not even say that that's scientific papers, because scientific papers all include argumentation all the way throughout. They give us analysis and interpretation. But what I think collectively, those of us in the room today, or are many different rooms, but in the shared online space today, our goal is that we can tell wonderful stories about the best, most interesting, most innovative research. And whether that's about brains or any other topic, it might be possible. I hope you leave this session knowing that you have stories to tell. Those stories are powerful. They can change the way that people see scientists. They can challenge old, long-standing stereotypes about who gets to be a scientist or how you work, what you're like. And perhaps most importantly, they can illustrate the process of science, the culture of science, all of the frustration and the beauty and the elegance and the terror, everything that makes this career, this life that you've chosen, so powerful. You can tell those stories. Thank you for listening to me. And we would now like to open this up for live questions.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm joined by Liz now, and she's here to answer your questions. Just one, Liz, it's how would you actually respond to a friend who shared the pandemic video on social and might believe it, but is not interested in reading any fact-checking sources?
I love this question, so thank you for asking it. For me, my brain is going through a whole number of questions of my friend, the situation, and myself in a moment. So I want to first distinguish between misinformation and disinformation. So misinformation is anything that's wrong. Disinformation is a deliberate attempt to mislead. I would want to make sure that I appreciate, is it that my friend just happens to believe this thing, or are they pushing some agenda? That would guide my response. I also think that we have to remember that we may have multiple goals or diverging goals. It might be that this is a dear friend of mine who I care about, and I want them to understand and appreciate why this video is a problem. It also might be that I think I can't convince this particular friend on this thing right now, but I know that we're not only having a conversation between the two of us, but we're signaling to everyone who's watching. So your communication style, the way you relate with your friends, is unique and authentic to who you are and what that looks like. For me, I would sort of go through context, and it would be, I would open by saying, like, if I decided I'm going to respond to this in whatever social media platform it is, it could be like, you and I have argued about this for years, and I know you are ready for what I'm going to say next. You can validate that friend and say, like, one of the things I admire so much about you is like your desire to get to the bottom of a mystery, or how strong of an advocate you are for, people who've been harmed or something like that. But then we're going back to like communications basics to say, like, but when I see you posting things like this, it makes me angry, or it makes me feel worried because, and then you can fill in what your exact issue is with sharing that particular piece of information. I personally tend to like to give people opportunities to save face, especially if you are in social media forums. This is a friend, people that you've got an audience who are observing your interactions. I would much rather give people the benefit of the doubt and a graceful way out than back them into a corner. And finally, the thing that I like to keep in mind for this was a book that my co-director of the Story Collider introduced me to. It's called Radical Candor by Kim Scott. And it's the idea that you care personally, but confront directly. And that for me is how I would actually talk to a friend, someone who's important in my life, if they were sharing a piece of propaganda or misinformation.
Thanks, Liz. Here's another question. what do you think was the best communication and the worst communication piece on COVID-19?
I think that's an impossible question to answer as posed, but I really appreciate the tenor and intention of it. So admitting I am biased here because the journalist I'm going to mention is my husband, in fact. Ed Yong at The Atlantic has had a whole series of long reads about COVID. And one of my favorites was, why is this also confusing? So what he's doing is attempting to cover science that is a complex story that is still unfolding in real time, that we may not have clear answers to actionable questions yet, by giving people a framework that they can use to understand. So it's not merely, he also wrote another piece called Everyone Thinks They're Right About Masks. And this was back when there was a lot more uncertainty about whether or not we should be wearing masks. And instead of trying to say, you should do this or you should do that, he gave hungry audiences a way to make sense of the information that they were seeing that validates why there is this difference of opinion. And so I think that kind of work is outstanding. The kind of coverage that I think is damaging is the kind of like TikTok journalism that just covers new preprints uncritically, or worse, report out a press release from an institution without any kind of analysis or outside peer review or the scientific process, because I think that can be exhausting and it adds to confusion and misinformation, even if it's well-intentioned.
Great, thanks, Liz. Here's another good question. Sorry, can't get my screen up. There it is. Okay, so someone would like to know how you establish trust with someone who has anti-science views. That seems to be the key to getting them to listen.
Yeah, I mean, so let's all be honest with ourselves. Attempting to get someone to trust you in the middle of an argument when they're a stranger that you've had no connection with in the past, that's asking a lot, especially just given the tenor of arguments that are happening around many of these issues. I absolutely think that the ways we can and should be doing this is to become more trustworthy. So I talk about this, being honest and transparent in your answers, admitting where the bounds of your knowledge are, not only to your audience, but also to yourself as you work to expand them. Identifying the difference between when you have a value-driven or an emotional response to a particular part of the conversation versus what we actually know as researchers or scientists, I think is important. I am always a proponent of building relationships with other people who already are trusted within their community, because we can think about amplifying other messages rather than attempting to one-on-one build trust with people who have maybe good reasons not to trust us, quite frankly. I think being able to interrogate why there is that current lack of trust. And like I said in the keynote, recognizing that claiming there is a generalized anti-science added worldview is not well supported by any of our available data on how people actually are making sense of things. Most people want to say that their worldview is backed up by science. They may question the motivations and behaviors of people who have conventional expertise and credibility, but that's legitimate. And I think especially appreciating and recognizing those underlying causes of whatever distrust might be there is a really important first step and towards mending a relationship there.
Here's another one. My experience is that people react differently to spoken versus written communication. Do you have specific advice for responding in writing rather than in conversation?
Oh, thank you for making me think about that. I don't have research that I can think of that shows how we would do that. I tend to feel, and this is only based on my lived experience, that whether I'm talking to strangers on social media or to my friends and family, that the jargon and the academic language that I use to telegraph expertise and credibility when I'm on camera like this or on stage or in a professional setting doesn't always serve me well. And the more that I try to write and speak the way that I do in typical conversation, so that my identity as someone who cares about science is not removed from my core identity as their friend or colleague or daughter, whatever it might be, that it helps integrate these parts of me. It helps position the information that I'm trying to share with all of who I am. And I do think that that part is important. And I know I'm dodging the question here. I'm trying to buy time and let my brain tick and just think, have I read or seen anything that would be interesting and helpful for us? I'm coming up short, but one of the things I wanted to mention to everyone who is watching is you heard me in the presentation mention that I have a public Zotero library of research publications. And I'm going to look to see if I can find any in this area. We are going to share that link. It'll pop up in the chat. That won't be enduring, but we will also make sure that we share this with all of you if you are interested in the evidence base for this communication advice that we are giving here.
Thank you. Here is another one. Could you speak specifically about how you communicate regarding issues like animal experimentation?
Yeah, so all of these, I don't even want to say polarized, because this isn't a typical example of a polarized scientific issue, but it is very emotionally heated. The people who are coming into a conversation have a certain set of expectations about how scientists behave, how they do research, how they reach conclusions, and how they're going to behave. I think one of the powerful things you can do is disrupt those expectations. So one thing that we see is people who have not done animal research themselves, are not connected to it personally. They think, oh my goodness, in order to do this, you must be a callous, cold person who just doesn't care about the animals, in your work. The scientists I know who conduct animal research, that couldn't be farther from the truth. And typically they attempt to emotionally distance themselves because that is what is required to do their jobs, but also to present their work to their peers. But by being able to share what the toll this takes on them, and why they still believe it's so important to do, that helps move into that personalized storytelling narrative space of, here's what I think about, here's what's going on inside my mind or behind the scenes, and here's why I choose to take on this sacrifice to make these decisions. It doesn't mean that everyone's going to necessarily agree with you, but it certainly shifts the debate away from sort of typical talking points that people might be much more used to hearing, and also discrediting. Whereas when you talk about your own choices and your own experiences, that has so much more validity because you're talking about what you yourself have gone through and believe. Thanks.
Do you have a method for finding a story to tell, figuring out what will make a good story?
Oh my goodness. Yes and no. So I am not a natural born performer. A lot of my friends and colleagues are, they're comedians, they're actors, they are professional storytellers, and they are just incredible wells of information, of stories. It seems like they come up with them all the time. And especially early on in my tenure at Story Collider, I was so frustrated because I thought, how can I do this? I want to tell stories. I like listening to them. I believe they are important, but when I come to myself, it's just like everything I've ever done escapes my head and I feel stuck. So, there is a many time award-winning storyteller named Matthew Dix, who has a technique he calls homework for life. He keeps a spreadsheet. I love a good spreadsheet or a database. And every day he puts down just one single thing that happened to him that day that could be the basis of a story in the future. So it's kind of like journaling or keeping a diary. And he argues that this helps give his days more like granularity, especially as he's a parent of young children. He says the days can just blur, the months and years can go by. But by doing this, he remembers those moments as they happen, things that have emotional resonance to him. And we often find, so the Story Collider does in fact offer trainings and workshops for faculty, researchers, scientists in particular, because we are the people who've never been trained how to do this and actively trained against it. And so this is one of the biggest pain points in the process. And it was something I really wanted to figure out, how do we do this? Part of it is getting out of your own head and allowing yourself to be creative, free of the judgment that we typically are, sort of going through. I know I do this all the time. Like, well, I could tell a story about that. Oh, but that's probably not important enough. Or how would I get a message in there? Put that aside. And then we start looking at strong emotional resonance. What are moments in your scientific career where you have been enraged or so curious you couldn't stand it, or shocked or joyful or sorrowful? We know emotions are really important in storytelling for a whole variety of reasons, but we also experience strong emotions when the stakes are really high. And this makes for good storytelling. That tension when you don't know how something is going to go and the consequences are very dire. That is typically a great place to look for story content. And then honestly, the best thing is having an outsider. Like we use our team of producers and story coaches are trained to do this. We're asking, what were you thinking? Why did you do that? What happened next? And being able to see the outside perspective, because we take for granted so much that we do and think. And we would presume everyone would behave the way that we behave, but that's not true. This is what makes storytelling and science storytelling in particular so delightful, is that all of the processing that you're doing as you face a decision, the options that you went through and discarded before you took an action, that shows like the scientific process in action. That shows your unique and idiosyncratic approach to the kind of research that you do. And those are the kinds of things that I think make for excellent stories, whether they're big or just tiny little moments in our careers.
Thanks, Liz. Well, we are just about out of time, and just wanted to ask you one more question. Sure. In spite of all this, some scientists will still think talking to the public is a big waste of time. How would you answer that?
I really think this is about an alignment between our behavior and our expressed values. So on one hand, I can make the same pragmatic arguments that have been made in so many formats, so many times, more powerfully than I can make it today. But if your research is taxpayer funded, you owe an explanation to the people who are making this possible. I also think it goes towards the validity, like the sort of social legitimacy of science as an enterprise. If you want people to appreciate and support and buy into this, we need to make them part of it, listen to their concerns, consult them when decisions need to be made in a meaningful way. And more important than that too, I think there's another layer of sort of pragmatic arguments. If as experts, you decide that it's not worth your time talking with people, you've now ceded the entire public debate to those who might very well have interests very far afield from yours. And that vacuum is filled with other voices. I think we have a combination of responsibilities. Some of them are more on, I think, a value and moral grounding. Others are tactical and pragmatic. But I hope that we all recognize we don't need to be all engaging in the same way. That we have our own particular approaches and our own particular niches. Some of us might be wonderful on TV. Does that mean everyone should be on TV? Of course not. But figuring out how you uniquely can contribute what it is that you are doing and why it matters so much, I think that is ultimately a social good.
Well, thank you, Liz. This presentation has been wonderful. And how can people get in touch with you if they're interested in learning more?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter. My very unique username is just my name, @LizNeely. But more importantly, I encourage you to go to storycollider.org. You can listen to our weekly podcast. A new episode drops every Friday. You can see our upcoming shows, which we are performing online every Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And you can find more about why and how we undertake this wonderful mission in the world about telling true personal stories about science to help humanize scientists, illustrate the scientific process, and correct the overrepresentation that we've had for too long in science by a very narrow set of voices. We can do a much better job of showcasing the reality of science and research.
Well, thanks again. And I want to remind the audience there's another communications workshop tomorrow at 5:30. It's how to use social media to get out the word on your brain research. Thanks again for coming, and thank you, Liz.
Thank you all.